Hi there. In this video, we're going to be talking about scrupulosity, sometimes known as religious OCD. What is it? How do we know if you've got it? And most importantly, what can we do about it? Now, before we go into definitions, I want to quickly say that this video is in no way passing judgment on the concept of religion. We're not here to argue for or against it as a broad concept. The only thing I would encourage as a general rule is to try to develop your own internal value system based on your own idea about what it means to live a good life. And if that definition is rooted in or influenced by religion, that's awesome. Also, if it's not rooted in that, that's equally awesome. Just be the best you can be. Now, scrupulosity OCD is particularly stressful, and it's something that I personally struggled with myself. So if you're dealing with this right now, you have my sympathies. I've been there and I know how much pain you're in. Trust me, it can and does get better. Now, there are infinite ways that scrupulosity OCD can present, but here are a few examples. Maybe you're feeling really anxious and the only way you feel you can relieve that anxiety is by visiting someone with authority within your religion. For example, a priest or an imam or a rabbi. Perhaps you have been transfixed with reciting a particular religious text on loop in your head, or you've compulsively been Googling to see if you've committed a sin. Maybe you're consumed with questions about God and morality. You might feel compelled to recite a very specific prayer before you go to bed every day. Otherwise, you'll be filled with anxiety about something bad happening. And the list really can go on. It really can present in so many different ways. To keep things simple, let's loosely define OCD as being a compulsive need to take a particular action in order to relieve an unpleasant feeling. Now, for scrupulosity OCD, that action should have a religious, a moral, or a philosophical component. It can be so tempting to want to figure out if you are suffering with a particular OCD subtype, but ultimately, it doesn't really matter, as OCD is a shapeshifter and its many forms are dealt with in broadly the same way by embracing feelings of uncertainty and leaning into the anxiety, remaining with that anxiety until it dissipates, and of course avoiding compulsions no matter how tempting they can be. In terms of my journey with scrupulosity, the idea of being objectively bad or a sinner for me was a seed which was planted unknowingly during my childhood. I was met with a lot of criticism and given far too much responsibility. The UK NHS website acknowledges that people who have been bullied or neglected are far more likely to develop OCD. When most animals are under threat, their body is knocked out of homeostatic balance and flooded with adrenaline to propel them out of crisis. Think of a zebra fleeing from a lion. If the zebra escapes, the adrenaline wears off and the zebra goes back to normal. It no longer feels anxious. That's how it's supposed to be for humans too. But OCD sufferers can get stuck in this state of fear for years. It certainly was the case for me. But what do we actually do about this? Well, if you've been on your OCD recovery for a while now, you'll likely know about sitting with uncomfortable feelings and using ERP. And these are really the things to be doing. But I want to delve a bit deeper into scrupulosity and talk a little more about internal values and boundaries first. One of the reasons that scrupulosity OCD dominated my life for such a long time was because I hadn't cultivated my own internal boundary system. I was so used to a life of having to placate others out of fear that I had no room for what I considered to be good or bad values. There simply was no room in my life for me. As a child, I eroded my own sense of boundaries in order to please those around me in a drastic attempt to keep me safe. My father left at a very young age, and that helped fuel my sense of being bad or not being good enough. Children assume that they are the reason bad things happen. This happens unconsciously to give them a sense of control and causality, so they can temper their behaviour to keep themselves pleasing to their caregivers. This software, these rules, usually continue to run us in adulthood. And that is why we need to make them conscious and often change them if they're not serving us in the present day. Now, back in the early days of my OCD recovery, I had no fixed idea of what was good and bad. I looked to external sources such as religion, friends, family, TV, everything. Then OCD started to play the what if game. What if I'm a sinner? What if I am bad? Well, if we take all major religions, it would be impossible to follow all the rules. Therefore, it would be impossible for me to live without objectively being a sinner. And this thought on loop terrified me. When we have no boundaries, we become like clay for the world to shape for its own benefit. This is dangerous, and that's why it's so important to cultivate your own value system. You need to decide and be willing for it to be wrong and imperfect, but you need to decide what is good, what is right, and what is bad. Where will I stand? When will I turn the other cheek? Who am I? You get to choose. And not only do you get to choose, it's really important that you do. Now, if I tried to actively work on my value system and boundaries during an OCD flare-up, there's no way it would have worked. So this is something for you to work on when you're in a calmer state. When you feel calm, I would encourage you to define outside of an anxiety or OCD attack what is good and what is bad to you. The 20th century Viennese psychiatrist Viktor Frankl talks about the dangers of not having a defined sense of meaning in your life. He says sometimes people do not know what they wish to do. Instead, they either wish to do what other people do, conformism, or they do what other people wish them to do, totalitarianism. So, to start defining your own value system, a great place to begin is to look at people you admire. What qualities do you warm to, and which ones repel you? Start asking yourself questions to help define these boundaries. But remember, you can only do this work if you're in a non-anxious state. If you feel like you're having an OCD spike or anxiety flare-up, this is not the time to do this work. But let's say you are feeling okay. You might look at the different areas of your life, relationships, friendships, career. Let's stick to relationships as an example. You might ask yourself, what do I think it means to be a good partner? Well, one thing is I'm never going to cheat on my partner. Okay, but what if I look at someone else in the street and find them attractive? Am I a sinner? Should I feel guilt? Well, as a human, can I avoid finding other humans attractive? No, not really. It's instinctive. If it happens, it happens. I can avoid whether or not I cheat, but I can't control glancing at someone and finding them attractive. Okay, so it's fine to look at another person and find them attractive, but it's not okay for me to cheat. This is an example and not necessarily a value system for you to follow. It is always up to us as individuals to follow values we personally align with. These are really broad brushstrokes and it may even sound obvious, but a lot of OCD sufferers are so used to being stuck in a state of terror or guilt that these internal boundaries haven't been built in a rational way. The problem with this is that if you don't know what you've decided is personally good or right for you, then you're far more susceptible to everyone else's ideas and values. So, boundary setting is useful work if you're feeling a little more level. But what happens if you're in the middle of an OCD flare-up right now? Rule number 1, regardless of what your unique variation of OCD is, you avoid giving into the compulsion. And if this feels too overwhelming, remember that techniques such as delayed response can help you to build up to this at a pace that works for you. Okay, so let's give an example. Let's say I compulsively pray every night the Lord's Prayer. And again, just to be clear, nothing wrong with being religious or praying every night. What we're talking about here is feeling a compulsive need to pray driven by uncomfortable emotions or sensations like guilt or anxiety. Okay, so I'm about to recite the Lord's Prayer on my knees as part of my ritual. What do I do instead? I don't recite the prayer. I sit and I breathe and I focus on the uncomfortable emotions instead. But Nova, I can't do that. My anxiety will be really high. You're right, it will be. But every time you engage in a compulsion, you're reinforcing a neural pathway which tells your brain, here lies something to be feared. The only way out is through the discomfort. There's a great quote from American professor Joseph Campbell who said, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." Which in our case means stopping our avoidance of the things we're frightened of in order to retrain the brain to no longer see them as being dangerous. Now, the first time you sit with the fear, it's going to be unpleasant. But every time you do this, it gets a little bit easier because your brain is learning. This is not a threat. You do not need to be afraid. Let's rewrite the rules. Now, it could be easy to misinterpret the advice as being to run away from the thoughts, to try desperately to avoid thinking about it. But that's not the answer, because avoiding the thought in itself is a compulsion. Instead, what we need to do is to sit with the fear. Now, when you're sitting with the fear and the intrusive thought pops into your head, screaming, telling you, that you're an awful person, what we need to say is, cool, I acknowledge that. A part of me wants to express this idea. I'm not going to argue or agree. I'm just going to observe it, like a raindrop on a window. It's a thing that's occurring. It's like the weather. Because here's the other thing. The thought isn't really the thought. Think of it this way. Let's say you've got someone who has a stressful job, a stressful partner, a terrible childhood. They're constantly in stress, and whilst holding, say, a cup of coffee, they trip up and spill the coffee all over themselves, having a complete meltdown in public. To passers-by, they may seem like they've had an outburst due to spilling the coffee. It may even seem to some as being over the top, but we know there's more to it than that. It's not the incident, but instead it's the years of history fueling and reframing it. To summarise, your thoughts are not what they appear to be on the surface. They're corrupted safety messages based upon the fear you've internalised. So one method I love for being with the fear involves sitting down, planting your feet on the floor and breathing through your nose for 6 seconds. Holding your breath for 3 seconds and then breathing out for another 6 seconds, just to centre yourself a little. Then going again, doing the same breathing pattern, but focusing on the exact area in your body where you can feel the anxiety. We're not focusing on the thoughts, nor are we running from it. We're just cool with it being there. But the sensation, the anxiety, the tingling, the stress, whatever you want to call it, focus on where that is in your body. Assign it a colour, a shape, and breathe as before for 6 seconds, holding for 3, and then breathing out for another 6 seconds. Do this 3 times. You don't have to do it exactly like this. It's just an example of how to sit with it. That technique comes from a great book called Letting Go by David Hawkins, which I highly, highly recommend. Just want to take a quick time out at this point to ask that if you're finding this video helpful, please like, comment and subscribe. It will help more people to see it and help you to make sure you get notified when more videos go live. Thank you. What can make scrupulosity one of the toughest forms of OCD may be an unwillingness to want to recover. You may fear that letting go of your compulsions would label you a sinner or make you bad. But I would have you think of it like this. In order to live the best life you can and be of the highest service to others, you have to learn unconditional self-acceptance. And this is something that psychologist Albert Ellis talks about. There's a societal idea we have in our heads that when we finally get that promotion, I'll allow myself to relax. When I earn that certain amount of money, then I'll feel proud of myself. This is all toxic thinking. There's nothing wrong with being ambitious, but you're far more likely to succeed if you turn your inner critic into an inner ally. Make a decision with me right now that you accept yourself, flaws and strengths alike, unconditionally, because all humans are imperfect and it's perfectly okay to be human. Everyone's on a unique journey, and it's also important to not compare yourself to others and remember to go at a pace that works for you. These techniques are skills and practices that can be built upon and developed, so always remember to set a pace that encourages you to build confidence and momentum. If you're someone who struggles to sit with uncomfortable feelings, then I have a completely free anxiety release audio which you can download from the link in the description below. Before we go, I have a quick challenge for you. We've been talking about building a value system, so I want you to write one thing in the comments section which you value about yourself, and I'm really looking forward to reading and seeing all of the wonderful things about all of you. So see you next time, and hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your days.